And this week, Amanda's going to be talking to us about a threshold item that's applicable to any type of agricultural producer of any size, and that's entity selection. Hi, my name is Mike Zahrt. I want to welcome you to Legal Strategies for the Michigan Farmer, where every week our agribusiness practice group will be bringing you a short 10 to 15 minute video on legal issues specific to agricultural producers. We know you've got a lot of time in the cab this time of year, and we're hoping to bring you some content that is both educational and maybe a little bit entertaining while we're at it. So for our first week, we have Amanda Dernovshek joining us. Amanda practices in our Lansing office, and in addition to her agribusiness work, she also does employee benefits work and is our resident expert on helping women business owners attain various women-owned small business certifications. And this week, Amanda is going to be talking to us about a threshold item that's applicable to any type of agricultural producer of any size, and that's entity selection. So Amanda, thanks for taking some time with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Mike.
So before we get into the tour of what's a C-Corp, what's an LLC, what's an S-Corp, and what's best for each farmer, as a more foundational issue, what's the importance of having a legal entity, and what are some of the risks that farmers run operating as a sole proprietorship or a general partnership?
Mm-hmm. So, Mike, I think that's a huge question, right? But the main heart of what we wanted to talk about today is the reason why you need a business entity is to have some liability protection. This will protect the business owner from personal liability. And if there is no entity, then that protection is not there. So just to kind of put this in more practical terms, if there's a business owner that is entering into contracts and taking on liabilities and debts, they are going to be personally liable for those debts and those obligations. But if they take the initiative to set up an entity, maybe an LLC or a corporation, then those debts and obligations are actually borne by the entity itself instead of the individual. So having a formed entity can minimize those debts and liabilities, and it can also help to minimize taxes. And another reason we suggest this for all of our farmers is to help with the implementation of succession planning, which has been a huge topic these last couple of years. It's much easier to transfer a single business entity rather than all the little equipment and vehicles and bits and pieces of a business. So we kind of wrap it up into a nice, neat bow, and then that is easier to transfer for succession planning purposes. And typically for farmers, we see that most often they'll have a land owning entity and then an operations entity. Sometimes if farmers have very specific lines of businesses, they may have a third entity that just focuses on that line of business. So it's very customizable and it's very specific to every farmer and their specific goals and needs and plans for the future. But just circling back to the liability piece, one thing to keep in mind is that just because you set up an entity, it doesn't mean you're in the free and clear in terms of those debts and liabilities. There is a doctrine called the corporate veil doctrine that Michigan courts have looked at for the last hundreds of years. And they basically say, okay, it's great if you have an entity, but you actually need to operate the business in such a way that you're respecting that entity. So if you have a corporation, then you need to make sure you're having your annual meeting and you're taking minutes of important decisions. You're keeping track of all the contracts that you're entering into, and you're making sure to have your separate bank account for your entity and for yourself, and there's no commingling of funds. So it's kind of a two-step process to create this liability protection. It's both setting up an entity, but then operating it in such a way that respects that as well.
Yeah, that's very important. You know, we see that from time to time, especially for people who do it right and they've got, that separate land owning entity versus an operations entity. And maybe you've got a transportation entity hanging out there too as an additional liability silo. It's only effective if you use it properly, and not just from a creditor protection perspective, but like you said, with succession planning too. You can do it now or you can do it later. I've seen farmers, die with a sole proprietorship, and we all know that a farmer with 200 acres doesn't have one 200-acre parcel, right? He's got 5 40-acre parcels. So do you want to transfer all those deeds after you're gone, or do you want to do it for your kids ahead of time? Once you put it all in the box, all you got to do is move the box and you're all set. So those are great points. So take us through the tour of entities, if you will. We've got C Corps, we've got S Corps, we've got LLCs. So if you can give us the 10,000 foot view of what's each, advantages, disadvantages, some farm specific considerations, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So really there are a number of factors to decide which entity is best for you. And like you said, there's limited liability companies, C corporations, and S corporations. So let's start with C corporations. I think those are most commonly known. And C corporation has more formalities than a limited liability company, but it generally provides greater transferability of ownership interest. And what we mean by that is a C corporation, the owners are called shareholders and they own shares in the corporation. Those shares can be transferred very easily. They can be assigned to someone in your family. They can be sold to another business. And there's often not restrictions on those transfers. So this can make it very easy for succession planning and also just for general transferring of your interest in the corporation. One huge negative about C corporations, and one thing we talk to clients a lot about, is this double taxation idea. And what we mean by that is at the corporate level, the profits are taxed. And then when distributions are made to the shareholders individually have to pay tax on the money that they get from the business. So there is a double layer of taxation with corporations, and corporations are required to file a separate tax return. So those are just some tax related things to consider with corporations. Another interesting facet of corporations is that you can provide for different classes of shares. We don't often see this with farmers as typical options, but there's a whole host of things that we can do with different classes of shares. For example, there may be shares that permit voting on different items, and there may be shares that do not permit voting. One thing that this is actually, I'm thinking back to one client where this has actually come up for Mike and I, where there was a father who had a son that was part of the business, and he wanted to start transferring ownership to his business or to his son over time. And the way they chose to do that is that the father was going to retain a class of shares that had all of the voting power, and the son was going to get a class of shares that didn't have voting power but still had ownership in the entity. And what that did was it allowed the dad to control the business for a few more years while he transitioned before retirement. But it also really gave the son some skin in the game and felt like he was part of the business. So that's an opportunity with corporations that LLCs don't have. And then the last thing I wanted to note about C corporations is they're not typically used for agribusiness industry because S corporations and LLCs offer the same benefits to farmers without the double taxation. So I guess with that, I'll just jump straight to LLCs. We often use that acronym, but what that stands for is limited liability company. LLCs are known as a pass-through entity because all income, gains, losses, deductions, and credits are passed through the entity to the business owners themselves. And all of that is reported on the owner's tax return. So there's no separate tax return that's due for an LLC like a corporation. And LLCs are really flexible. There's not as many formalities as other entity types, and you can really design an LLC to meet your needs and document those choices in your documents. I think that's probably the best thing about an LLC is that the Michigan law allows you to really customize it and make it what you need it to be. So you can allocate taxes in a certain way, you can allocate distributions to multiple owners, and you can really limit how those owners are able to transfer their membership interest in the business in a whole host of ways. And Mike and I commonly have conversations with our farm clients about what those restrictions should look like. So it's more than we can get into today, but there are a whole host of options for making this customized to your business. And that's the beauty of an LLC. Another benefit of an LLC is that it is a good option for a single owner. So if you're a farmer who is in business on your own and you don't have other owners, this is a type of entity that would work for you as well. With a single owner, the LLC is treated as a disregarded entity for purposes of taxes, but it's still in place for purposes of liability. So that goes back to the first thing we talked about, which is the liability protection. So even if you're a single farmer with no other owners in your business, having a limited liability company in place will give you the liability protection that we talked about at the beginning of this session.
That's a great point. And when I talk with some of my farm clients who've been operating as like a sole proprietor, right, that has been reporting on their Schedule F for 35 years, the big takeaway for them is that there's no reason to not have an LLC compared to a sole proprietorship. It's going to be reported on your tax return the exact same way. Everything's going to look the way it's always looked. You're still going to have absolute ironclad control over everything from day-to-day activities. But if you've got a liability, they can't take your house, right? They can't come after your personal bank account. So there's really no reason to not have an LLC if you're a sole proprietor. And the benefit what I like about LLCs is that flexibility you talked about. And you can kind of flip that switch. So if I just want to incorporate my sole proprietorship, that's great. If I find out that I'm getting killed on self-employment taxes, well, I can flip the switch. I can make an S election and elect to treat my LLC as an S corp. So you give just a little commentary on what's the difference between LLCs versus S corps, and when does it make sense to flip that switch and make that S election?
So when we talk about S corporation, what we mean is what Mike's saying is that the entity has made an S election. This is not a separate type of corporation, but it's a tax election that you make with either an LLC or a C corp. An S election is taxed more favorably than the original business structure because you don't have to pay a certain portion of employment taxes. So there are restrictions if you make an S election. For example, there can be no more than 100 shareholders, and the shareholders must be all individuals, estates, or certain types of trusts. And you can't have a shareholder that is a non-resident alien. So there are restrictions with making this S election, and it really depends on, who is part of your business and who owns your business. I don't think that these restrictions have come up very often with our farm clients, though, and I think that this is a really great option for them. Another thing to consider with an S election, though, which could come into play, is that there is only one class of stock permitted. So if you're interested in having multiple classes of stock, the S election may not work for you, but that's something Mike and I can, chat with people individually about. So yeah, I think the S election can be a great option for people. And like I said, you can either make the election with either a limited liability company or a C corporation.
Yeah, we typically involve the CPAs on that too, because it's partially a self-employment tax question. If you've got an LLC tax partnership, for example, and you're just pulling out distributions, all of that is subject to self-employment tax. You flip the switch, you tax it as an S corp, you're going to get W-2 wages, which is going to be FICA withholding. But then anything in excess of those wages that you take out as an S corp distribution, you don't pay self-employment tax on. So every dollar of S corp distributions you take out is self-employment tax savings. And there's that sweet spot, right? Because you've got extra tax returns to file for an S corp, you've got K-1s that need to be issued. So there's that additional accounting cost, and you find that sweet spot of what's the point where I'm getting killed on self-employment tax by a sufficient amount to justify the accounting costs for the S corp savings. So that's good summary of those issues. So we talked about types of entities available. What's good for which situations. We almost always use LLCs for all of our entities: operating, land holding, transportation, you name it, with this option to flip the switch to S if it makes sense. But in terms of setting these things up, if I'm a sole proprietor, some of the things that I'm probably going to be worried about are property taxes. I've got a lot of acreage. Is that going to uncap? I might have a bunch of farm vehicles and trailers. Am I going to get killed on sales tax if I move this to an entity? So maybe you could talk about those logistics just for a minute, those common concerns folks have.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing you mentioned is the uncapping of property taxes. And the answer really is no. Michigan law allows us as attorneys and you as farmers to file what's called a qualified agricultural affidavit. And this is a procedure that basically you tell the state, hey, it's the same person basically that's using the property. We're still using it for agricultural purposes, and therefore the property taxes should not be uncapped. So there is a process for doing that, and we can make sure that those documents are filled out properly and reported to the state so that you don't have an uncapping of your property taxes. The second thing that you mentioned related to sales tax on transferring farm equipment. I know from working with farmers that farm equipment is not cheap. It's very expensive, and sales tax on those large numbers can be huge. So the good thing is Michigan law provides exemptions that cover the incorporation of a sole proprietorship by a farmer. So when that sole proprietor transfers equipment and vehicles into the entity, there's no sales tax that's required. Which is great. So basically, if you set up an entity, you're not going to have an uncapping of property taxes. You're not going to have to pay sales tax, and you're going to be gaining a lot of liability protection, which is why we think this is a great option. And then the last thing that I wanted to circle back to was one of our most common questions is about control of the farm. If I set up an entity, am I going to lose control of my business? And the answer to that is no. Like we talked about earlier, there are a number of organizational documents for both an LLC and a corporation, and we can draft those in such a way to make sure that the people who need to be in control of the farm, maybe the original owners, still have control of the decisions that are being made and things that are happening with the business. So we can document those in such a way that you would not lose control of your farm. And those can be amended and revised as circumstances change. So as your business grows and maybe you have additional owners or you have children who are becoming owners, those can be changed and we can make sure that it works for your situation specifically.
That's a great point. Yeah, and it just goes back to our kind of big picture takeaway. There's really no reason to not have a legal entity. There are certainly some homework assignments that you've got to do up front. It's not kind of an overnight thing. It's a lot of work up front, but the protection you get is worth it. And there's really no material costs other than the initial setup fees. There's no taxes. We'll preserve PA 116 agreements, and you get a lot more control on how you manage your business, how you pass on your business, those types of issues. So I guess last topic here, speaking of passing on your business, we're seeing all of these baby boomer farmers retire, move their businesses on. If I'm a baby boomer farmer or any farmer, and I've got this daughter that wants to go into agriculture, we're seeing this big women in ag kind of movement right now, and all these programs that incentivize that. We've got women-owned small business certifications and that type of thing. Yeah. Is it as easy as I gift my shares to my daughter and now she qualifies for these programs? Or what do I have to consider if I'm a women in ag that wants to qualify for some of these special government programs?
Mm-hmm. So, Mike, I wish it was that easy because I'm an advocate for women and I wish that they could get access to these resources, but it's actually not as easy as just transferring your ownership to your daughter. The Small Business Administration has some rules about what they're looking for in terms of certifying a business as being women-owned. And what they mean by that is that more than 50% of the ownership, whether that's membership interest or shares in the corporation, are owned by a woman. The day-to-day operations have to be managed by a woman who has the background and education to know about the business. So ideally with a farm business, she was raised on the farm and has had multiple years of experience, knows how to do everything on the farm, whatever that entails. But then she also has the management authority to actually make decisions both day to day and long-term strategically for the business. So it's not only a matter of owning those shares, but it's really deeper than that. It's about the woman being able to run the business and do the business. And there are a whole host of documentation that the Small Business Administration would ask for to substantiate those things, but that's kind of a general overview of what they're looking for and those kind of threshold requirements that you would have to meet.
Yes, as with any government program, all sorts of paperwork. So I guess the takeaway for that is if somebody's interested, they should call you and get you involved early because some pre-planning is really important. I think we have run into a couple of situations where dad has just gifted some stock and they go, hey, I'm not eligible. What's going on? And once you get that point, it's almost too late. You really got to plan in advance.
Yep, absolutely. And those are things that you and I deal with regularly, and we can help them plan ahead, make sure the documentation is there, and really guide them through that process.
Well, thank you again for spending all the time with us. This is very helpful. I think we'll post our contact information here below the video once we get this posted. So if anyone has any questions or concerns about, maybe you don't have an entity and you need to have one formed, or you've got one and you're not sure that it's the exact right fit for your business, or your business situation has changed and you're ready to get that next generation involved. Those are all issues that involve entity selection, and we'd be happy to help you. So feel free to reach out to either of us. We'd be happy to talk with you more. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you back next week with more legal strategies for the Michigan farmer.